I'm stitching a row of scallops using these circle rulers, and I've taped them together to give me a little more stability. You'll see I have painter's tape that's that on the top that are holding the rulers together, and then on the back I have painter's tape doubled over just to give a little more grip. And what I'm going to be doing is stitching around a semicircle. So actually the edge of my quilting area right here is the light blue line. It's not actually the basting line. The basting line will later be covered by the binding. But when I'm aligning this ruler up, I want to make sure I get this full half circle. And to do that, I'm going to line the halfway point, these markings, the quadrant markings on the rulers, with the blue, very faint blue line that's on the bottom of this block. And I'm going to stitch all the way around the ruler. And my biggest tip for working with circles is if you can, and you can't always, but if you can, make sure you have a couple fingers on the ruler and a couple fingers on the fabric from each hand. So it is much more preferable for me to hold it like this than to hold it just with one hand and try to have the other hand grab the fabric. That's not going to give you enough stability. So you're going to see I actually am holding the entire quilt sandwich. So let's go, and remember, I'm not going to move my hands until I see that needle moving. And it's kind of slow and steady wins the race. The other thing I should say here is that I have a Supreme slider on the bed of my machine, which makes the fabric glide a little more over the bed of the machine. I don't want friction there. I want friction between the ruler and the fabric so they move as one, but I don't want friction between, my fabric and the bed of the machine. So I'm going to keep going. Now, at this point, if your ruler slipped, this would be the time to correct it and just move it over a little bit. Don't keep going to a point when you know it's going to be wrong. Okay, and now this next scallop is going to be a partial scallop. So this one, see, it's going to go kind of off and stop when I get to the edge of the quilting area. So let me line it up there. I'm looking at those quadrant lines. And remember, this scallop border, we're going to work both the top and the bottom of the area with the scallop, which is going to create a beautiful interlocking design. Okay, so I did the bottom portion, and now I'm going to do the mirror image of that on the top. And I know I'm going to need to come down a little bit this way to start going back up that way. So it's basically trial and error. I could measure it, but more likely I'll just kind of free motion down this block, and I don't have to go that far, so I didn't bring my straight line ruler over, but if you wanted to, you could certainly bring your straight line ruler over and quilt down that way. Okay, so now I have to line up, use those quadrant lines again to stitch this next semicircle, sort of partial semicircle going up that way, and I haven't traveled down quite far enough to get my semicircle in. So this is where it's sometimes hard to see a little bit on a domestic, so you might have to rotate your quilt just a little bit to be able to see. Ideally, you don't want to be rotating all the time, though. This is not, you shouldn't be rotating it like you would for a walking foot. Okay, so now I'm going to just center my grip again, and then I'm going to keep going on. Okay, so now I'm going to move my ruler over, looking at those quadrant lines again, and continue stitching. All right, and you'll notice I didn't move that machine. Now here, now that I can get to this side of the ruler, I'm going to grip with both hands. And again, the ruler it doesn't matter whether the ruler's in front of the machine or behind the machine. If you can, hold it with both hands because you'll have better stability. Sometimes you have to have it in a weird angle, particularly in a long arm. In domestic, you always have the option where you can rotate the quilt if you want to, but on a long arm you don't. So you get used to holding things in sometimes uncomfortable ways. Okay, so you can see the scallop border that is starting to happen here, and it's a really pretty design to do on any quilt. Okay, so I'm getting ready to quilt internal circles using these rulers. I still have them taped together for added stability, but you'll notice I moved the top tape from there to here so it doesn't interfere with this internal circle. The other thing is I'm going to be slipping this on and doing little purls right down this line, and I already showed you this on a long arm. But I need a complete circle to be able to do this well. And so what I'm going to do is insert this key. And remember, I'm using the number 1 ruler on the inside, so I'm using the number 1 little cross. And I'm just going to tape this in. If I was going to do a whole bunch of circles, I would probably tape from both the bottom and the top so this key doesn't move, but I think I'll be okay just for today. Again, I'm going to try to hold the ruler with a couple fingers from each hand, and I'm also holding the fabric with a couple fingers from each hand. And I want to make sure that my circle is centered on this line, so I'm looking at those quadrant lines and making sure that they line up right on that line, okay? So here we go. And by the way, the lines are on the underside of the ruler. You don't want them on top because there's a little bit of distortion that happens when the lines are on the top. Now my stitch length is being determined by the speed at which I'm stitching and how hard I'm pushing that foot pedal, but in general these are pretty small circles, and so my stitch length is going to change and become smaller as well. You'll know you need to decrease your stitch length when you start seeing like what looks like long stitches, and as curves get tighter, there's usually more of a need to decrease your stitch length. Like if you were just quilting in a straight line, you don't need to have a super small stitch length. So let's go around. And one thing I didn't say, but I'm definitely doing, if I go counterclockwise in this circle, my next circle is going to be stitched clockwise. And the reason why is I don't want any jagged lines going in and out. I don't want to pucker. So instead, I just continue on this way. And, you know, in this case, I must have measured, a little bit wrong, because look what's going to happen. This circle's a little wider than this area. So I'm just going to quilt down the side of my area, and I kept going so you guys could see what I do here. Until I get to the edge of my ruler again, and then I quilt around. Okay, now to end, I need to do a few stitches very close together. Then I'm going to take off my ruler so I can just pop this out. If you have a frame set of rulers, you'll need to start and stop your thread instead of slipping your ruler on that way. But I love the frame set, so there's times when you like this set better and times when you like the frame. So one more stitch. I have the loop of thread to the side. One more stitch, needle down, needle up, presser foot up. I usually use my buttons. I don't use my foot pedal for that because it's easy to overrun the stitches. And then, of course, bring the quilt out a little bit from the machine, because if I cut it right here, I'm going to end up with a really short bobbin thread, and I don't want that. I want a longer bobbin thread. So I'm going to cut over here, and then you can see I have my line of circles, or circles and 3/4 there, but that's okay with me. And I hope you enjoy quilting. This is a great design for sashing on your quilt tops.